Hello and welcome to a fresh episode of NBRI, New Business and Retail Insights from the Center for Retailing Studies, Mays Business School, Texas A&M University. I'm your host, Venki Shankar, Director of Research and Coleman Chair, Professor of Marketing. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome our guest today, Dr. Norris Bruce, Associate Professor of Marketing at the Naveen Jindal School of Management, University of Texas at Dallas. Norris's research focuses on the use of incentives in the marketing of durables, most importantly, the effectiveness of advertising and many contexts, including sequential distribution of motion pictures, the dual effects of advertising on sales and brand building, the effects of pulling and forgetting on multi-theme advertising, the effects of ad format, message content in digital advertising, and the moderating effects of brand messages in TV advertising. It's published widely in Marketing Science, Journal of Marketing Research, International Journal of Research and Marketing, Journal of Interactive Marketing, among others. Norris has a PhD in marketing from Duke University. Thank you, Norris, for joining me in this conversation today. How have you been in the last few months?
Coping with, it's been a difficult time for all of us, right? We've been some global pandemic, and but my wife was a nurse, and so we have a strict protocol at home.
Good.
Once you visit us, you're required to wear a mask, and we have all kinds of cleaning products at home, and we have just in case things get difficult.
Okay, so you're well prepared, and it looks like you're practicing all those safety guidelines very well. So that's great to know.
Right.
Before we get started, I did manage to describe you the way that I thought I have seen your research, and I've always been fascinated with your work. But how would you describe yourself in maybe 5 words or less? If there are 5 adjectives or 5 phrases that you could use to describe yourself, what would those be?
On a personal level, I think all of us in academia would share some traits. Would you agree?
Sure.
I think all of us, in some sense, are resourceful, right? We have to innovate in all kinds of settings. When resources are scarce, we have to innovate around reviewers and so on and so forth. So I think, like all of us, I think I'm pretty resourceful in that sense. I'm also quite optimistic in my outlook about life and research. I always find sort of a silver lining in every dark cloud. And that's my mother's gift.
That's great.
Of course, I'm patient.
And that is very much required during these tough times.
Absolutely.
So thank you.
We have to be patient because things will get better, but they'll get worse first. Right? I have a sort of independent streak, though, both in terms of thinking and work that I do. My father always said to me to be respectful first to people and then to titles, in that order. I'm kind of humble as well, especially in terms of my work. I think everything I do can be improved, right? And I always try
to hear, yeah.
Outdo myself every time. It doesn't happen, but that's the objective. And that kind of sums me up a little bit.
That's great. That's you be modest yourself, the way that you approach your adjectives or descriptions. That's a good start. Tell us a little bit about your research journey. Where did you get started, and what are the twists and turns, and where are you right now?
That's an interesting question because I'm sure you have many as well, right? I remember when I was if I go far back, when I was a PhD student, in one of my very first classes, I was given an assignment to write some code to simulate some things. And in the stats class, and I did it, and the professor was quite surprised. He didn't know that my background was in computer science and programming. But as a result, though, he was very open, and through that connection with him, I kind of fell in love with what they were doing in Bayesian statistics. So it has an influence on the kind of work, my methodology in particular. So that was a turning point.
So there was a prior in your case.
Exactly.
Sorry to use the term.
Yes, I developed a prior.
Right. Okay.
And it was not only in terms of substance and what they were teaching, but also in the human dimension as well, right? You have people, reaching out to you and saying, here's how you want to think about problems. So it got me a really nice start in being comfortable at Duke, and they were very inviting, that department. The other thing I would say a turning point is when I was trying to get ready for my thesis. I was struggling to settle on a topic. I would find, as you know, right, a PhD student, you're finding a topic every day. And the problem was that I was trying to get everything aligned, not only the question, but also the approach. And Rick Stalin, my advisor, gave me a data set and said, take a look at this. And just by looking at the data set, I found an interesting question.
Oh, great.
And that question, I fell in love with the question and said, I'm going to follow this question regardless of the methodology. And so that, I think, is when I fell in love with the research process of discovering something that I don't think anybody else knew.
What was that question? If you
It was about essentially gave me an automobile promotion data set, right? Durable goods promotion. And I looked at the data set and saw that there are some automobile manufacturers, right? Toyota, for example, that were using trade promotions extensively. This is manufacturer dealer promotions extensively. And there were others that were hardly using these things. So the question is why? Why firms in the same industry are—
And what did you find?
The issue was that the high quality manufacturer was using these are quality-based, performance-based trade promotions. They were using them to influence quantity and prices in the market, right? So they were offering these quantity trade promotions that encouraged dealers to set a certain price, a price that they would set if they were making the decision themselves. In other words, it was mitigating the double pricing problem, right? And
so
that
it solves the double marginalization.
Precisely.
Channel.
It mitigated it. Eh? It mitigated it because it didn't resolve it entirely. It wouldn't be exactly what the manufacturer would do, but it was close enough. And so that was very exciting to me. And
after that, how did you end up with advertising for most of your research?
There you go. So one of the things that I came to market as a theorist, right? A game theory guy. But I essentially was someone who liked to work with data, right? An empiricist at heart. And my training was more in that area, as I signaled to you in my first comment about the stats department.
Okay.
So I always wanted to get back into empirics. And I had an opportunity to work with Frank Bass. And I think that was an extraordinary point in my career.
Oh, good.
I collaborated with Dr. Bass, right? Who made so much to our field, as you know. And we were working on a paper that deals with the promotion of different kinds of advertising themes. And I fell in love with not only advertising, but also the question of advertising content, the role of content in advertising as a moderating factor. Economists study a lot of advertising in terms of advertising spending and elasticity. My interest in the topic came about, do these different content in the ad itself, the message itself, is that contributing something? And so that was a nice paper, right? We looked at different themes of publication, but there's a little twist in that story, if I could just get that in. During the process, in the review process, when the paper was way along, as you know, Dr. Bass became gravely ill. And at the time, I was the lead author of that paper up to that point. And my colleagues came to me and said, can we do something very small just to acknowledge Dr. Bass's contribution to the field? Let's make him the lead author, right? I become the second author. Of course, this is what they said to me. You need to be aware that in the future, the paper will be known as Bass et al. And not Bruce et al. Okay. And I said, fine, who cares? There'll be more papers. The paper is not known as Bass et al. It's a widely cited paper.
Right.
That's a nice little story. So it's looking at different.
So that was generous of you. So it's nice to have a last name starting with B.
Yes.
You can't be the first author if you're an equal author, at least.
Yes.
Right?
It looked as if it was by letter, but it was actually Bruce first, and Frank was the last author. But we did that in his honor. That was an interesting.
So that's a foray into advertising. And,
yes.
Since then, you haven't stopped. Looks like you've really looked at all different angles.
Yes, many different angles. Which if I could just think about it, another paper that I think, so we look at many things, right? I worked with Natasha Zhang on looking at advertising of movies.
Right.
And that's an interesting question because there is this spillover problem, right? In those days, we're thinking about movies in theaters and movie in the rental situation. And the question is, when is advertising appropriate? Is it better during the theater phase? Is it better in the rental phase? And what is the role of word of mouth? And we discovered that essentially it's in the earlier phase. Word of mouth is much more effective after the movie has come to market, which kind of makes sense, right? Because then you've built up at least some word of mouth. The product has been in the market for some time, and we found that result. But it was an interesting result to look at advertising across different stages in the life cycle of a product, right?
Right.
That I think was a really interesting paper. And all of us were assistant professors at the time, so it's nice to work with your peers at that level. And of course, after that, we had a nice paper to work with Prasad Naik. And that I think was quite interesting. As you know, this is an interesting problem in industry. Advertising, as you know, from the perspective of agencies are compensated based on intermediate effects like awareness, right? Likability of the ad, and how the ad influences brand thinking.
Right.
Right? We could not ask the agent to be compensated based on sales because they don't have no control over sales. But the brand manager cares about sales, right?
Right.
And so an ad can be successful for the agency, winning awards,
but not for the
brand. There you go, or the firm.
Right.
And so the agency said to us, can we find a way to establish how advertising build brands while simultaneously influencing the sales?
Sales, yeah.
And so the contribution there is not only the result, of course the result could be different from a different brand, but we showed that you can actually establish these connections and show a mechanism that we can, and for very famous brands.
It was very, very useful for managers.
Yes, exactly.
To have that, yeah.
Exactly.
And did you collaborate with any companies or industries for that particular project?
Yes, yes. In truth, yes, because the data came from an ad agency. Yes, that's right. And so that perspective was through the ad agency. But we understand the full problem, right, from the brand perspective. Well, that was a consulting effort. And of course, it was collaborative work with Kai Peters, right? And it was his connection with an agency in Germany, a famous agency we all know. And they had this issue in the discussion with the clients. Right.
And I know that you work a lot with companies in either consulting mode or.
Yes, I do. I do some.
So what are some of the challenges those companies are facing with respect to advertising? And I'm tempted to start with the often used quote from John Wanamaker's: "Half of spending is wasted. I don't know which half it is." And today, even the smallest of marketers, the small business entrepreneurs, all the way to big companies, keep asking the same question, except that the smaller marketers are now going into more measurable, search ads and display ads on digital. So they may have a little bit handle. But what do you think? Is the question still not answered, or do we have some answer to that question?
Well, we know in general that advertising works, but I think it's case by case. I think we have to always measure advertising, right? Because there are many factors that can determine if advertising is now working or not. And so advertising is something that firms will have to continue to measure. I think again, in the offline space, as you say, it's difficult to measure, right? But we can do some things, perhaps with surveys, but it's limited, we understand. In digital space, we can measure, but there are some other issues in the digital space that we can perhaps talk about later on. But I think for in general, though, I think my issue with advertising research is that we need to begin to study more the role of content, right? It's of course, short term, we want to know if the thing works or not, right? Did I get a lift or did I not get a lift? But I think content, the creative component, can impact, can moderate the role of spending.
In that regard, I am impressed by your new paper with Werner and
yes, exactly,
which is forthcoming in JMR, if I'm correct.
No, it's already there.
It's already there. Sorry, I'm a bit late.
No. It's my fault. The thing is, nowadays you can post the paper on your site.
Oh, right.
They're a little strict about that.
So you have pre-advertised your paper already. Yes. That's nice. But let's walk us through your key findings in there. I found it initially very fascinating when I read it, that you looked at the content of several ads. I can't remember how many. And what struck me very, very interesting way was that you found that there is a way in which the logo and the content, small messages have effectiveness. And in fact, those moderate the effectiveness of advertising overall, right? So tell us something more about those.
Precisely. So just to clarify the point. So we had 60 brands, right? We had 60 brands. This is in Germany. And the idea was to understand how the messages, the actual brand message related to the brand, influences performance of the brand in some way. Right? So we're looking at different kinds of messages. Messages that are conveyed, that are attempting to create salience, say like logos and things like that. What we call brand elements in marketing, right? And also things like the brand's claim its attributes, right? Claims about its benefits and so on and so forth. Attribute, benefits, and salience type cues. We wanted to know how these things influence advertising performance. And we had 60 brands. And so the difficult task was to go collect the data, right? We had to employ judges, PhD students, to actually look at these ads themselves, right? And we gave them instructions for them to infer. Now, of course, deep learning could help us in the future, right? In extracting this information. And so what we found, though, interestingly, but it's that the salience type cues, the logo, the brand names, the representation of those in the ads that are working best in influencing advertising performance. Right? And amongst, interestingly, thank you, amongst the salience type cues, it's not the brand name. It's the
That's
logo.
fascinating.
Because
the logo is more powerful than the name.
And the brand name, exactly.
Yeah, that's a fascinating insight. On that same note, would you also try to say the logo is a little bit more subtle than the brand name because it's not so explicit. It's more in the background.
Yes.
Would you also extend it to say there are subliminal elements in the advertising that have a role, but we have not yet explored it in depth or understood the effects in
absolutely. So there is something going on here, perhaps. And one thought came to mind was that we know that when people are what advertising, right, they're not attending to the details, right? And so it's these cues, the logo cues and things like that. They're not listening to the actual attribute discussion about what the brand does and the benefits. Especially, well, we have to be careful here. We're looking at consumer goods, right? Fast-moving consumer goods. And so I don't think consumers are processing that much detail. But certainly the logo itself, right? Those are the things that they may take into the store, in the retail store, right? And allows them to search and sort through products in the store. So the simple subliminal cues from the logo in particular, I think is working here. And that I think is something perhaps needs to be explored in more an experimental setting. But that I think was an amazing finding. Now the thing is, why it's amazing is that firms spend so much in developing brand names and worry about brand names in advertising when it's actually the logo.
Right. Well, that brings us to another fascinating topic, which you've again worked on, which is digital advertising.
Yes.
So we know that in 2020, now there have been new projections of post-COVID, overall ad spend is expected to be down from last year, about 5%. However, what we know is that more than half of the spend, the global spend is now expected to be 2020 is about $615 billion, out of which 335 billion, that's over 50% is going to be in digital. And about 180 billion in search, and then the 120 in maybe display or more. So we're moving very quickly, rather fast, maybe post to digital. And again, take your findings on the content, like logo and the subliminal. Because in digital, you don't have too much time or attention. Wouldn't that have more of a prominent salience and a role in the effectiveness in digital?
Perhaps so. Because again, you're right. The digital space, right, is constrained in terms of what you can present, and consumers avoid. Digital advertising is not something consumers seek out.
Right. So, display advertising for sure.
Yeah. So display advertising. Yeah, I'm referring to.
Right.
And so yes. One of the things I'm hoping to see is some of these ideas about content spill over into the digital space. Right. For example, as I said, maybe we need to think carefully now about with all the ad blocking that's going on, we have to think carefully about content as well. Right. So we need to start thinking about design digital advertising, and perhaps in fact brands could begin to use some of these ideas that we have from other spaces. Where, for example, I said the logo here, right, would be something that should show up mostly in these ads. Because again, digital advertising, in fact, in the study here, most of these digital ads were essentially what I call digital promotions, right?
Right.
They're like what you used to get in the coupon in your, in your
Right.
coupons from Sunday clippings.
Right.
And it's been animated and presented in the digital space. That's exactly what I was studying.
Right.
And those ads, the content is quite limited.
Right.
And so, yes, there could be something there.
Right. But walk us through the key findings in that 2017 paper of yours, where what I found was very interesting. If I remember correctly, you found that, some of these promotional digital ads, display ads, had very short-term static. I think you looked at static versus dynamic
Right.
type of content, right? Like dynamic would be like using Flash, static would be using just a GIF image. And then you found that for the short static ones, you had short-term effect, but the dynamic one tended to have carryover or longer term.
Yes,
Am I
yes.
interpreting it correctly? Yeah.
Yes, you're interpreting it correctly. So that's one of the things that interests me in this project was, I know I've done a fair amount of work in advertising, and we know media matters, right?
Right.
And so when I came to the problem, I said, well, if media matters in general, maybe media matters in the context of digital advertising. So I was somewhat kind of making an analogy when I started that project. And so I wanted to look at the different kinds of media in parallel. So formats, for example, animated versus static, it would be a classification. The size of the ad, right? Or its orientation on the page. I was looking at those things, and as well, the content of the ad itself. And here we were able to, again, these ads were quite simple. They were either a price discount or some information about a product that's in the store to the retailer. And we wanted to know what was effective, what format was effective, flash, dynamic versus static advertising, right? Which theme, what is the appropriate, if I'm going to place a particular message, what format should I place it in, right? Is it appropriate for retargeting or targeting? So there are many questions I was posing to that data. And we were able to get some nice results. One, as you said, you hinted to, was the fact that we saw that the animated ads had longer carryover, in the sense that in the analogy would be they're more memorable than the static ads.
If I were to take the equivalence, Norris, we used to know that TV advertising, because it was the equivalent of dynamic, for example, it's visual and it's longer. They used to be used for brand building, whereas your regular flyers or promotions were static, and then they were like used for deals.
Exactly.
Is that analogy?
That is the exact analogy, Vinky. Right. In fact, I sort of expected that result because I'm familiar with the study you're talking about, the kind of questions. So that's a perfect analogy for it. So animated ads, of course, we didn't study videos here, right? So animated ad was, in my mind, when I was looking at the results, it reminded me a little bit of...
Yeah, it's relative, yeah.
Relative to, say, TV versus print, right? And so that was a result that's very strong, robust across findings. But the other thing that was, I think, the result that resonated well with colleagues was Catherine Tucker had a 2013 paper that looked at retargeting. Retargeting is a strategy of following consumers. If they come to your site, you kind of cookie track them. And when they land on another site, the question is, what do you present a consumer? So I'm a retailer, and I have a campaign running. Someone comes to my site, browses around, and decides not to make a decision, right? And they visit another site, they end up at CNN, and we have tracked them to CNN. The question is, what information should I present that person? Now, if you think of path to purchase or funnel, you may ask, where is that person in the funnel? And as a result, what information should I pass to them? What format should it be in, right? And it turns out that the best thing you can do in this context was a priced ad in a static format.
Right. This reminds me, we see a lot of these frequent ads served on us as browsers or visitors. When we fail to click something, the retargeting ad comes back and gives you a deal, right?
Yes,
Say
that's
$10
exactly.
off, just buy
Yes,
it today. If you buy it today.
that is the finding. And again, these were early days, right?
Right.
That is a strategy. Now, Catherine Tucker had done some work, and I think she won the Odell Award for this.
Right.
Her experiment showed that for retargeting, it only works if the consumer's preferences, if you can establish consumer preferences. Here we're saying price sensitivity is one way of deciding what to serve the retargeted consumer.
Okay.
So that I think was an important sort of a link to establish work, which is always.
But couldn't both be right in the sense that if you are consistent with the preference, if there are price sensitive consumers and non-price sensitive consumers.
Yes, exactly.
With price sensitive consumers, what you say really makes a lot of sense. With the non-price sensitive consumers, perhaps some other
mechanism, right?
mechanism.
So I think it's the same story. It's the same story, but as I said, ours is a specific kind of preference, right? Price, but there could be other factors, other preferences as well. So her comment was her work was sort of broader statement about retargeting. Ours is more precise in terms of pricing. But again, it was beautiful to see that there was some confirmation of this result from some other papers as well.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
This has got very useful insights and implications for retailers.
Yes.
As you say, many of them are online only retailers or digitally native retailers. Many of them are purely brick and mortar who are actually using the internet for as a display medium primarily.
Yes.
But many of them are omni-channel now, both brick and mortar, and increasingly in the post-COVID world, a lot of them have migrated. Even those who are not so much online have been forced to go online.
Online, yes.
So, is there any kind of takeaway here for these kinds of retailers where they're trying to move more of their business online, both order online, pick up offline, or order online, get it delivered from your store nearby? All of the above. Is there any advertising or retargeting implications here?
Well, clearly, I mean, the idea of what to serve. The key problem is to understand where consumers are in the purchase funnel, right? And what information to serve. And that I think is a takeaway from the study, right? But I think that's an area that needs to be explored even further. Later on, we can talk about a project we're working on that looks at that. But I think since my paper, advertising formats have become infinitely more complicated.
Right. I think they are becoming creative by the day.
Exactly. So I think there is still work to understand how these formats are whether they help or not. But I think the difficulty for firms is to understand how these things work jointly. Right.
So joint optimization, I know you're very good at optimization and allocation of resources. So what are some of the challenges and how can we approach them?
Yeah, so the difficulty is, of course, we need good data, and we need good models, right, that can jointly assess the effect of multiple, let's just put it in a single channel, right? Multiple formats. Right, and how these are driving sales. It cannot be a sort of a piecemeal thing. You have to look at the joint effects because there is synergy in these kinds of things. And we have to also think about, I think the targeting mechanism is important. You have to understand retargeting differently may require different kinds of messaging versus, as I said, initial targeting. Or in fact, one result in the paper, yes, it's quite interesting that we didn't discuss, is that we found that female shoppers tend to engage more so than male shoppers.
Okay.
And they tend to browse.
Can you unpack that a little bit more?
Well,
in terms of
what we find was that female consumers tend to click more often, right? And they for example,
they engage or interact more with the
interact more, exactly. They interact more. Put it this way, let me be simplified. Female shoppers tend to interact more with the campaign.
Right.
Not that they're purchasing more, but they're interacting more with the campaign. And my analogy to that was the fact that female shoppers may be what they call, as I said, men buy and female and women shop. I had that kind of site in the front of the paper.
But do you find anything specific for certain categories, more so this behavior or less?
Unfortunately, this was for a single category. Right?
Oh, you did.
It was a retailer that is in a single category. Put it that way. And so the result was not category specific.
Specific. Okay.
All right.
That's understandable.
Yeah.
Now, if you were to look at the future of advertising, let's shift gear a bit. Where you mentioned that now the formats are increasingly getting creative, and I was fortunate enough to be part of a thought leadership team, which came out with a paper, which is going to come out in Journal of Advertising, which is on computational advertising. We refer to computational advertising as any advertising that use the computational power to match the ads with the target. So that the right ad with the right content, right message is served to the right person, and not only right time, but on the right location now, because you now can target people by their movements, right? So where do you think advertising is headed with such micro targeting and micro targetability? Let's put it that way. Do you think advertising is becoming more personalized, more direct, so much so that it has ceased to become that creative area that lots of people used to go into? Now it is becoming more of data scientists.
Computer science, the computer science task. I think both. I think advertising, the creative element, again, my interest has been content. I think my work is telling that content matters, right?
Okay.
It's nice to just to predict, right? But we still need to understand why people are making certain decisions. So these computational models essentially are focusing on making that match, that predictive thing. In fact, computational advertising is emerging from the computer science field. I'm happy with it. But I still think there is a need to understand why certain things work, why people are responding. And so I think it's going to have to be sort of a two-way thing. So both tools are necessary. We need to understand what works and why it works, as well as the matching problem, which is essentially a computational problem.
Very good. So on that note, we know you discussed the fact that we also need to have better ways to understand the combined impact, because it's very tricky to model all these things. Is experimental approach the best way to go? Because at least we can separate and understand like different content. You can experiment that.
You're asking me a political no. Yeah, so no doubt we need these experimental approaches, right? Because that's how we establish, as we know, experiments give us the closest thing we can get to causality.
Right.
And so we have to understand causality. So that is of course important. But experiments can be, one of the things I want to see more are repeated experiments. That is, we need to also look at the long-term effects. Yeah. Exactly. So experiments, okay, I do an experiment, I establish causality, but that's cross-sectional. Right. I want to understand behavior over time. Right. And so that I think is where, of course, we can have repeated experiments. But the experiments I'm seeing are not looking at temporal effects. Right. And one of the things in my paper, even though it was an experiment, I made an argument to the reviewers that dynamics, effects over time, is something that the experiments are not addressing. Clearly causality is on their side, but I don't see this looking at long-term behavior. That's
a very challenging issue. So maybe a series of experiments over time, tracking it would be the way the experiment will go. We talk about experiments, the consumer behavior researchers primarily use lab experiments, but field experiments is really gaining very popular.
That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about field experiments.
Field experiments. So now, with all these platform companies like Google, Facebook, being able to do countless number of experiments every day, they call the A/B test.
Yes.
Where are we headed in this space? Are we going to be in a situation where there's going to be continuous A/B tests being performed, and we will be knowing the effects of any particular element, which is, as you said, logo, format, different types of content, different types of message, tones, the visual display, colors, everything. Can we all not know the answer to this question by doing these experiments at a large scale from these companies? And one question that everybody is asking is, will the role of academics be diminished when these companies to have the data, and are they able to really churn out and get the answers on the same day many times by doing these experiments?
The question is, do we have a role as academics? Given that these guys are the fire hose of data, right?
Right.
Do they need us? I still think that while these guys can run these experiments, I think there is still some limitation to the ability to look at these multiple effects in experimental context. I cannot see experiments replacing other kinds of approaches. Now, the question I always ask is, can we learn anything from observational data? Right?
Right.
Is it only experiments that we can learn from? I'm not so sure, right? Because
observational data has been the primary engine that has been in the past, that's been driving our understanding, right? So
absolutely.
It's not like observational data without one at the expense of other. The question now is becoming, how much is all blurring, or are we needing both? Are we also using insights from one to guide the other and back? Right?
That precisely. My view is that observational data can drive research questions, right? And then we can design careful experiments to establish causality.
Right.
Observational data is still required. Now, there are some contexts in which, now this is kind of a wild, but if you think of cigarette smoking, right? Much of what we learn about cigarette smoking, its harmful effects, right, on behavior is through observational data. Because we can't run cigarettes experiments and force people to smoke cigarettes, right? But I don't think that, I'm careful, there's no analogy like that in advertising. But I still think there's a role for observational data. And again, one is to be able to drive these hypotheses that we can test with experiments. But I still believe that there's a difficulty in looking at some of these joint effects over time. Those are very difficult problems to address in experiments.
But, so there is a lot of scope and role for academic research. I completely agree with you, because that's what I spent a sabbatical in the Bay Area and Stanford University, and talking to all these people, they still can answer some questions, but there's a lot of questions they cannot answer, and they need academics help on that. So I completely agree with you. Now, you mentioned that the role of content and creativity is still important in advertising, and that brings us to a very important issue, because now we have a lot of students who are now coming on to advertising. Now they understand that the new world of advertising is not just purely
competition.
Not just purely, 20, 30 years ago, people joined advertising to express the creative side of mind. But now, there's a lot of movement towards analytic side of mind.
Yes.
And now what you're saying is there's a role for both creative minds and analytic minds, and it could be a blended mind that's emerging. So tell us a little bit more about it. This will be very useful for students and current students and future students.
Okay, I think, so I'm also doing work on branding, right? The advertising role in building brands. And in that space, so I'll give you an example of a project I'm working on. I'm working on a project in which I'm considering how the content of the ad itself influences consumers' brand belief, and how those jointly affect consumers along the path, right? So we have to understand what messages, what information's consumer, what I want to figure out is what information does consumers need at every stage
of their customer journey,
Precisely.
Yeah.
That requires an understanding of consumer behavior. It understands, the message becomes more central now, right? The actual message in the ad itself. So for brand marketing, I think advertising has to remain focused on content, right? Because if brands are valuable, if brands drive sales, then an advertising can build brands. And to build brands, you have to create knowledge. Then it comes down to content.
That's right. So there is a role for creating and that brings us to another bigger question that's being asked now. The brands have value proposition. The past, used to have a positioning statement and used to advertise it widely. And if you had a resonating statement, you used to capture a lot of market share, at least for consumer-based brands. But now with the increasing role of computational elements and data being driving the force, and with consumers making decisions based on assistance using such as smart speakers and so on. There's also this debate about how, is the role of brand exaggerated now? Some have even gone to the extent of this brand really dead? That's the other spectrum, which is arguing that, maybe the brand messages don't have as much of importance in today's world. Particularly, you saw in post-pandemic situation where consumers could not even get the brands of their choice. They were forced to buy like whatever brands were available. And then since they got used to it, they probably reorder using Amazon, Alexa, or Google Home, and then brands' roles could be diminished. What do you think is going on?
I think COVID, this is a special time, right?
Right.
and so to use a time like this to make predictions about the future is quite risky. Right. So that's my first reaction to that. But still, it'll take some convincing to say that brands do not matter, because we look at the role of brands in society, how people love brands and associate with brands, and find meaning in brands, and brand. So it's hard to see how brands do not matter. But the question is, in my view, is how do we build brands? Does advertising have a role in building brands?
Right. What is the type of advertising that will
precisely, and the type of advertising, how it's delivered. Now, the thing we have to worry about is how the kind of advertising, offline versus online, how is it delivered? Can we communicate brand belief, and can we establish brand preferences in a digital format?
And user-generated advertising, like
precisely, where you don't have control over the message and so on and so forth. So it's very challenging.
For some brands, the users actually they build the brand image, right?
Precisely. So that's an interesting question too, right? When you outsource brand meaning, you allow the consumers to establish brand meaning. I think is an interesting question. A question that is the meaning that originates with consumers. I think the Dove campaign for beauty. Remember, you teach that course? That's the case.
Yes. One of the first social media. I think it's campaign. One of the most famous cases, right?
Right. Famous case in which they actually allowed generate conversation amongst consumers and allow them to help extend the meaning of the Dove brand in that sense. That was an example of that. I suspect we may see more of that kind of thing in the future. But again, that's very risky, right? Because again, consumers.
You can have your brand message hijacked.
Absolutely. So that's
is that what you're saying?
That's the challenge. Challenge. So.
But I think what you're been saying is fascinating. If anything, the future for advertising looks brighter and better.
Yeah,
that's what I'm seeing.
Yes,
because there are so many unanswered questions, so many fascinating ways in which advertising is evolving.
Yes.
Both in terms of content, media, messaging. All the analytics, measurement issues, targeting, exactly. A lot of problems to solve, and a lot of innovative ways in which to approach advertising. Is that a fair statement?
Very much so, and I think it's an exciting era to be in. And I've been studying advertising in the past, and I continue to study it in the future. And there's so many interesting problems, and now we can approach the problem in many different ways. We just talked about computation, experimentation, observational data, different kinds of media, online, offline, amongst online, multiplicity of ways, formats, sizes. This is where
researchers like you are so useful, trying to unearth and distill more insight.
Right.
But I want to take it to a more general level. In this age of uncertainty and global well-being that everybody's looking for, how can advertising be used more positively? In a social welfare, creating social benefits over the long term. Are there some ways? Yeah.
We can look at the COVID pandemic.
Right.
And ask ourselves, can advertising contribute to this discussion? One of the things in the COVID pandemic is a fair amount of misinformation, right?
Right.
And in some cultures, you would see public service advertising advocating certain responsible behaviors.
Right.
But you rarely see brands touching this topic in America. And there's kind of dancing around. I think advertising can play a role here. Yeah. Firms who advertise can play a role, but again, we are in a.
Do you think advertisers are too risk averse? Is that
Very,
why they're
very,
not?
very risk averse. One of the things, okay, one of the things I've been thinking about, well, you know the stories about, for example, advertising on YouTube, and then your ad being associated with some kind of a harmful, say anti-vaxxers or right,
Right.
or climate deniers or things, or even worse, right? And so many brands may pull their advertising if they fear that the ad may even physically be linked to those kinds of things on the same space. I think sometimes brands are just too cautious, too risk averse. Um, in those cases, I can
That
understand the risk.
sounds more like defensive advertising. But in a way, can advertising be used to proactively, help more? I'm not even thinking of public service advertising, but I'm thinking about a social component of advertising in every brand. Nowadays with the
Yeah,
millennials and the Gen Zs, we know that they really care for what the brand
environment
stands
and so on and so forth.
for. And yeah, the ESG, they care for environmental, social, and governance of the brand. So can a brand work in, you mentioned content messages being important. Can they make this as part of their overall message or content in
Yes,
the long run?
yeah, I think so. I think one of the things that this generation likes is authenticity, right? And
Right.
authenticity in advertising is I think it's necessary if you're going to target millennials. But we can also again, a brand has to be credible, right?
Right.
To take some of these positions. But the brands that are credible, I think, can take positions that offer some social value, advocate for certain issues that people care about, and in the end, it can benefit the brand in some kind of a halo way. So I think
Okay.
yes,
So you favor a little bit
yeah,
proactive
I
approach.
do. I don't fear it. I think, again, brands are risk averse because, it's investments and people can lose money. But I think if a brand has sufficient credibility in the market, they can take certain
But
positions.
ultimately, it is the consumers that should
It
drive that,
is,
right?
it is a
So if your
consumer.
consumers like millennials and Gen Zs, they really care about
They
something, the
care about
brands
those
have
issues
to pay
precisely.
attention to that, right?
Absolutely. So if you're
But
targeting
there are
those people,
if some brands are targeting, let's say, senior citizens
yeah,
who care about something else, care about
precisely.
healthcare, care about peace of mind, then they should be looking more closely at those
Right.
social benefits, right? In addition to that, right?
But it has to be, to be fair, it has to be undertaken cautiously, right? Because those are in a divided society. We have to be. I can understand why brands are
Okay,
cautious about getting into these kinds of issues, right?
right.
But they can benefit you depending on who you're targeting. No doubt, no doubt.
Excellent. Yeah. Now, are there anything else that you would see in the future that we should be thinking about?
Oh yes.
Um, yeah.
In terms of digital advertising, though, I think there's a long-term issue that I was thinking about years ago, and I have not gone back to it. It's this notion, again, you said a lot of firms are moving into digital space, but there are some problems over in that space. One is the notion of viewability, right?
Right.
We can't guarantee that
Clicks.
someone
Yeah.
saw the ad,
Right.
right?
Right.
There's no reliable measure of attention in this
Right.
context, and so the system can be gamed, right?
Right.
So we can have potential for
We
fraud.
still have click frauds and
Exactly.
still,
It's still a problem. It hasn't gone away.
yeah.
We don't
Yeah.
talk about it. What it has done is drive down impression prices, right?
Right.
Because we're sort of baking fraud into it. But the
Right.
question is, even at these prices, are advertisers getting the value for their
Okay.
investment?
Right.
We don't know this.
There's still improvements to be made in
Yeah,
that.
we don't know this, right?
Right.
And so the other thing is the presence of ad blockers nowadays.
Right. Right. And also, we didn't talk about privacy in the last,
Yeah, we don't talk about privacy.
last
These
couple
are
of years. Privacy has taken a huge
exactly.
meaning with GDPR and CCPA, California Consumer Protection Act. All of these would need another program to
Another
really
conversation, right?
discuss, right?
So these are sort of
Another
lingering issues
conversation.
out there. And if you're going to be
Right.
involved in digital advertising, you got to be aware of these issues.
So we've just scratched the surface.
We just scratched the surface. That's another
Right.
topic.
I agree with you on that.
Another guess.
Yeah, but it's been fascinating talking to you, Norris, and
Thank you
you've
very
covered
much.
a whole range of issues and
Yes.
you've offered a lot of insight. Are there any final messages that you'd like to give to our viewers who range from students to managers to entrepreneurs to member companies? Some of them are retailers, faculty, staff. wide range of
that's a tall
stakeholders.
task.
Whoever you can pick
I think
as your primary focus.
well, what's on my mind, I think from the standpoint of our colleagues, researchers, right? In marketing, we care a lot about endogeneity, heterogeneity, and those kinds of issues.
Right, right.
But I think there's another kind of robustness that we often ignore, and that is we often make assumptions about functional form and randomness without any consideration that these things can actually influence our results. And I have a paper in GMR, it's a methods paper, in which I spend a lot of time worrying about non-parametric methods and so on and so forth. And I find that these things are important as well. Right? They can bias and skew our findings as well.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading that paper soon, because it's very important for us to know what we don't know well.
Exactly.
Right, yeah.
So the other thing is, from the practitioner standpoint, I know data is becoming a big thing, but I still feel that artificial intelligence and these kinds of AI techniques are predictive things. And I think as marketers, as an academics, as scholars, we still need to understand, and even the industry to understand what is happening. It's important to predict things, but we need to also understand why things are happening. And this is kind of like a message to.
So we need to know the whys are explainability.
Why exactly, rather than just exact matching, just making the match, understand why the match occurred, and so on and so forth. We need to understand the why. I think that's important for even industry. For students, I think my area is quite exciting. We just discussed, right? There are a lot of things to study, a lot of approaches to the problem. And as long as we appreciate how these approaches help each other, I think we're fine.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Norris. Again, thank you for taking the time out.
You're welcome.
I really enjoyed listening to all the results and your viewpoints and insights. I hope our viewers feel the same. Thank you again, and good luck with the rest of your research. Thank
you very much, Venki. Thank you for the invitation.
Take care.